Hello, America. Happy Monday to all of you. Welcome to Furthermore with Amanda Head. Some news breaking over the weekend that the United States has reached a trade agreement with the European Union. Last week when I was at the White House, I had heard that this was 50% done, and then I heard it was 70% done. And I suppose that last 30% came over the weekend. So I am delighted to have my guest today. I've had him on in the past to talk about trade and tariffs, and he is just so, he is so fluent in that conversation. So we're going to bring him on in just a moment. He is Shanker Singham. He is the CEO of Competire. He is formerly a cleared advisor to the United States Trade Representative and former advisor to Secretary of State for International Trade of the United Kingdom. And we're going to dig into the details of this trade deal, what it means for the United States, what it means for the European Union, because yes, it means something beneficial for them too, believe it or not, despite the fact that you've heard that they made a ton of concessions. You know, it's almost a tough love situation, forcing them to deregulate and to make a lot of changes that is actually going to help their economy flourish as well. So we're going to get into that on the other side of this break with Shanker Singham. Hello, America. Happy Monday again to all of you. You know, July and August in Washington tends to be on the slower side, especially now at the end of July as we are going into the month of August. It's recess, although President Trump, I believe, is urging the Senate to stay in session because there are some 130, 40, 50 something appointees that they have still not yet put through the nomination ringer. So at any rate, we did have some breaking news over the weekend. Pretty decent news weekend, and that is that the United States has struck a trade deal with the European Union. So I feel like this is probably going to be one of the first dominoes to fall, and we will see possibly a cascading effect of other trade deals coming to fruition. But I have the perfect person to ask about that theory and to dig into the details of the deal. He is Shanker Singham. He is the CEO of Competire. He is formerly a cleared advisor to the United States Trade Representative, former advisor to the Secretary of State for International Trade of the United Kingdom. Shanker, thanks so much for being here.
Well, very good to be with you again, Amanda.
Likewise. All right. So I want to get into the details. So just on surface level, the news broke and I thought, okay, this is really great. And then I saw some criticism coming from folks in the EU who said that the EU gave up essentially everything and the United States essentially gave up nothing. Now, I know that that's not totally true. The truth is probably somewhere in between. But tell me your initial thoughts on it.
Well, you know, this is part of a wave that you referred to, a wave of deals that, we've seen a deal with Japan, we've seen Vietnam initially, we've seen the United Kingdom, we've seen a couple of other countries as well. And there are some other things going on with India and with Korea and some other markets that, may well come in by the 1st of August deadline. Mm-hmm. I think why the EU is significant is it has been very, very difficult for the US and the EU to agree anything in the area of trade for decades. There have been lots of attempts to do transatlantic trade agreements, to do the transatlantic trade and investment partnership. None of it has worked over the last 25 years. This is the first time that there's been a deal of any kind, really, of this kind of level between the US and the EU. And I think what it's showing is that, what the president said at the outset of all of this, and we discussed this last time we spoke, was the US is very concerned about other countries, particularly larger trading partners, that have essentially distorted their markets, not just through tariffs, but critically through other things like, and the EU has this in spades, regulatory barriers, all kinds of things. So you might have a low tariff for your American car being sold in the EU, but you'll find all kinds of other regulatory barriers that make it impossible to be competitive with the domestic industry. And you see that a lot in the EU. You see it in agriculture. We've recently seen a lot of attacks on US tech companies, for example, in the EU. And so there's a lot of things, and there's a lot of regulation that's very anti-competitive, and not only damages the US, but also damages the Europeans' their own economies. That the EU is growing extremely slowly, if many of the member states are not growing at all. And so there's significant problems in the EU, which they kind of acknowledge themselves, that there are problems that they have themselves and they need to improve. I think this deal, actually, notwithstanding the Europeans who are saying, they they gave away everything and the Americans didn't give up anything. This deal actually will help their economy in the long run, because if they remove all of these barriers and distortions that the Trump administration would like them to remove, and this deal is a framework, so you've got various specific tariff reductions, and then you have a framework to discuss some of these regulatory barriers. If they actually remove them, then their economies will grow. It isn't just a question of not damaging US exporters anymore, but their economies will grow because they'll have more competition, they'll have more imports, prices will go down, supply will go up, and wealth will be created in the EU. So in a sense, Trump is doing them a little bit of a favor in taking, a very aggressive approach to force them to do the kinds of thing that they need to be doing anyway in order to grow their economies. So I don't see this as a sort of mercantilist, win-lose kind of proposition. This could either be lose-lose if they continue there with their barriers and they have a high tariff as well, or it could be win-win. And I think we're moving into a scenario where we could see a win-win for both sides actually here.
Yeah. So when you have these EU ministers that come out and criticize the deal, what's their basis for saying that we gave up everything and the United States gave up nothing? What are they seeing?
Yeah, what they're basically saying is that we reserve the right to damage our own consumers with bad regulation and distortive practices that, by the way, also damage US exporters. And I think the problem is a lot of leaders in Europe, and this is why they're in the mess that they're in, quite frankly, but a lot of leaders in Europe see trade an entirely zero-sum, somebody wins and somebody loses. And that's not how trade actually works. What all the Trump administration has done is say, look, you have lots and lots of barriers to our exporters. By the way, those barriers damage your own economy as well. But I'm not, I'm focused on my exporters who are damaged as a result. I want you to change that. And if you change that, I'll lower the tariff. And if you're not prepared to change that, then this is the tariff you're going to have. And until such time as you decide you're willing to change those things, then we can have another conversation about lowering the tariff. So the EU tariff is 15% versus the UK tariff. The UK having left the EU, the UK tariff is 10%. So slightly better. And I think there are certain sectors in the UK, like cars and aircraft engines, where it's zero for certain.
Right. Yeah.
So if the EU wants to have that kind of relationship, they can have it, but they are going to have to make some serious changes. And I think this is also the conversation that is playing out in Stockholm today with regard to China, because the US and China are, there probably will be an announcement on China very shortly. I mean, it could be today, it could be tomorrow. I suspect it will be another, 90-day period. But what the Chinese will have to do is think about, well, if we want to get down to the kinds of tariff levels that, some partners of the US have got to, like the UK, we're going to have to make some pretty massive changes to the way we structure our economy. We're going to have to do something about our state-owned companies. We're going to have to do something about all the distortions and barriers that damage US interests in and other countries' interests in China. I'm not sure the Chinese are ready to do that at the moment, but at least we're in that conversation, and we haven't been in that conversation for about 30 years.
What was the tariff? So it's 15% now. What was it before?
I think the trade-weighted tariff of the US generally, EU not having a trade agreement with the US, they're on what's called the MFN rate, which is the WTO rate, and it's typically about 3%, 3.5%. Okay. So it's a significant increase, in the tariff they face, and it will do damage to their economy at a time when their economies, are pretty fragile. Right. There are a number of member states, France, Germany has been contracting for the last 3 years as an economy. France has got a huge fiscal crisis looming. So this is a bit of a hammer blow to their economies. So one would hope that they will wake up and they will say, well, actually we do need to change some of these things. We do need to make our economy a bit more competitive, and that means getting rid of some of these regulatory hurdles that they've erected to US and other, foreign businesses in Europe.
I want to get into some of those regulatory hurdles because you have two very much competing ideologies within the EU for the most part. Obviously, it's not. It's a group of people. It's not just one person. But that up against President Trump. President Trump is a barrier destroyer. It is, practically every one of his executive orders is dripping with the notion of removing barriers, allowing, supply and demand and the free market to flourish, allowing Americans to start businesses without all of this gunk, slowing them down by the government. And then on the EU side of things, it's very much the opposite. So talk to us about some of these barriers that needed to be removed. And does it kind of reflect what we see here in the States under President Trump?
Yeah, so it's a very good question, because what President Trump has done, he's not asking the EU to do anything that he's not prepared to do at home. Mm-hmm. So there is an executive order on reducing what's called anti-competitive regulation in the US. So there's a joint DOJ FTC task force that's designed to root out all of this regulation that is anti-competitive. In other words, regulation that damages ordinary market outcomes. So what do we want to see? We want to see, willing buyers, willing sellers meeting in voluntary exchange, and with as little in the way of that as possible. Mm-hmm. Every time you put something in the way of that, you basically destroy wealth out of your economy. So domestically, what the Trump administration is saying is we need to eliminate those things, because they are impediments, they are shackles on the US economy itself. So we're going to get rid of those. There's nothing to stop the Europeans from having the same process, by themselves to remove a lot of these things. And if they did, they would find that the things that they would be removing are exactly the same things that the US has been complaining about for years. Yeah. So be things like, they have a carbon border adjustment tax, which is essentially going in this year and next year. And it's basically, if I bring in certain things, steel, aluminium, fertilizers, various things like this, I am going to add a tariff based on the carbon production in those things. And that's going to be a barrier to the import of all of these products. Now, by the way, it does help the domestic UK or sort of domestic European industry. A lot of the European barriers look like they are designed to protect, things like health and safety, but actually what they are doing is protecting a European competing producer. So again, when you talk about competition and you talk about a voluntary exchange of willing buyer, willing seller in a competitive market, a lot of the European regulations damage that competitive market. They damage that competitive process. They have a deforestation regulation that's being imposed this year that would make it very difficult to sell products in the EU that have any kind of forestry component. This is very bad for developing countries. It's very bad for, the countries that produce things like palm oil, which is in all your food. I mean, everything you eat, sure, palm oil in it. And most of that comes from places like Malaysia and Indonesia and so on. They're all heavily driven, a lot of these regulations, by environmental NGOs who very much have the ear of the European Commission. So they don't really care about economic growth. They don't care about wealth creation. They just care about stopping a lot of these products and practices that they see as harmful to the environment. And what we've said is it's fine to have regulations that protect the environment, but they have to do it in such a way that does as little damage as possible to the normal competitive process. And you can do in ways that don't damage the competitive process. But what the EU tends to do is you have the environmental NGOs wanting to have this kind of regulation. And then you get a bunch of European producers who want protection from US firms and other firms saying, oh, this would be quite useful to have this regulation in place, because if it's in place, then I don't have to compete, because nobody will be able to get in and compete with me in the European market. And that's why it's called Fortress Europe. I mean, there's a lot of these kinds of regulations that interlock to prevent people being successful. So you might have a low tariff, but you find that when you get into the European market, you can't be competitive, and that tends to be what we have in the EU. On tech, there is a whole raft of digital actions that the EU is taking specifically to damage US tech companies. So there's a digital services tax. You've got to pay a tax on top of the normal taxes that you pay as a corporation. They they will use their competition laws to specifically damage the US platform companies. So all the big companies that we have, the Amazons, the Metas, the Googles, and so on, they will basically attack them because they're large. And the problem is that because they have this kind of approach to tech, they have an Artificial Intelligence Act, they have all kinds of statutes and regulations. And all they have done is prevent Europe from actually developing any of these sort of game-changing tech companies. So
stifling it.
Yeah, so now they have no tech companies of their own. They want to damage the only country that has any tech companies. And the problem with this whole approach is we're not in a world where it's just the US and the EU. I mean, we've got, they're essentially delivering things like AI, things like quantum, things that are civilizational, existential, if we fail to have a leadership role in this. They're delivering that to China. And of course, the problem with the EU is where they regulate, they tend to force other countries to copy their regulation. So a lot of this digital tech regulation that started in the EU is all over the world now. And so they have a very negative effect on the regulatory systems of other countries, precisely because of this, dichotomy you mentioned. I mean, on the one hand, we want voluntary exchange, willing buyers, willing sellers, a free market kind of approach. And the European approach is, no, we're going to have all kinds of regulatory barriers. And all of this, all that does is it means that your companies have to be really good at navigating regulation as opposed to doing what they do. So that's why they don't succeed in the EU, and that's why their economy is so slow and sclerotic. And that's the sort of two. And we really do have a battle for the world's operating system between those things. And it's a battle that up until this point, the US has been losing because the European regulatory system has become, the de facto regulation system of the world. Mm-hmm. I'll just give you one example that was particularly powerful. Senator Josh Hawley got involved in this. Archer Daniels Midland was basically sending notes to the grain farmers in Missouri saying, when you sell to our silos, you have to satisfy European deforestation regulation. These are American grain farmers selling to grain silos in Missouri for consumption in the US, having to do because it's easier to satisfy a single regulation. I know that if I've satisfied the European regulation, I've basically satisfied everything, and I don't need to have other lines of business. Now, the problem with that case is the European deforestation regulation wasn't even in place in Europe at the time. So Senator Hawley basically wrote to ADM and said, how dare you do this? This is an American company. You're an American company. The farmers are American farmers.
You're selling to Americans.
Why is the European law interfering with this? And that's why I say, it is a battle for the world's operating system. And I think you started to see the first signs of a sort of pushback on that. And hopefully what we will see going forward, because these are framework agreements, right? Sure. So you now have to negotiate within the framework a reduction of these types of distortions and barriers. Mm-hmm. And hopefully we will see over the next period that process actually occurring. I think people should look at these deals as sort of, as Winston Churchill once said, it's the end of the beginning. The first phase kind of is going to end on August the 1st, and then we're in another phase where, basically he's reset the system so that there are now US, relatively high tariffs compared to the past. But if countries want to lower those tariffs, they can. They can lower their distortions. Sure. But you can't blame the president for not taking at face value the statements by trading partners that they're going to change all these things when they haven't done any of that for the last 30 years. So I think he has some legitimacy in thinking that the US has been taken for a ride for quite a while. And obviously that period is now over.
Right. Yeah. And good thing. All right, everybody, we've got to take a very quick break, and then we've got a few more topics to wrap up. Welcome back, everybody. Shanker, I want to ask you about the enforcement side of any of these tariff deals, or any of these trade deals, rather, whether it's EU, UK, Japan, Vietnam, and anyone who is forthcoming, anyone who is upcoming. What does oversight look like? And are there nations out there that you fear have more of a tendency to cheat? What does cheating look like? How do we enforce that doesn't happen? Talk to us about that.
Yeah. Well, normally in a trade agreement, what happens is there's a dispute settlement mechanism in the agreement itself.
Okay.
And if one party feels like the other party is not complying with the terms of the treaty, you can always activate that dispute settlement mechanism. And if the party continues to refuse to comply with the treaty, then what you would do is you would withdraw the concession. So Trump has essentially said to the EU, 30% tariff is going to go down to 15 because you've agreed to do the following things. If you don't do the following things, then I will take I'm within my rights to withdraw the concession and your tariff will go up to 30% again.
Right.
Now, what you want to do is you want to lock in these commitments and the framework into an actual sort of trade agreement. And that's what the administration, I think, will need to do in order to give these some legal basis and some justification so that you can sue under them. Usually merely the threat of suing under one of these agreements usually causes the other country to change its position.
Right.
So you need to do that. So that's why I'm saying that there's another phase that we have to go through here.
Right.
Obviously, what's going to take the headlines is the big commitments to buy things from the US and so on. And so it's not surprising that those are the headlines. But
yeah, what, $750 billion worth of energy or something? Yeah,
that's that sort of thing. I mean, that's clearly going to be a headline. I mean, that's going to be somewhat difficult to enforce because obviously companies have to do that.
Right.
Commission can't, bind its companies in that way. But what I suspect, will happen in the future is that we will lock in some of these regulatory changes, lock in some of these other changes into an actual agreement with the normal kind of dispute settlement mechanism, which would enable the US to lift the tariff if they feel like that these agreements are not being complied with. But nations now know that the president is willing to do that. Mm-hmm. He's quite happy to have a very high tariff on them, and so I think the previous view was that it would never happen. So we don't need to really worry about it. The US, does the opposite of what Theodore Roosevelt used to say. You talk softly but carry a big stick. We tended to talk loudly and carry no stick at all. So. And so they knew that, and they kind of thought, well, we don't need to comply with any of these things. Right. That's different. We're in a different world now. They know that this could happen, and it has happened. And the more the president talks about how much he likes tariffs, the more he talks about, look at all this revenue flowing into the US. The more pressure they feel to make these changes so that they can get a lower tariff, because they know that he's quite happy to go to a higher tariff. It doesn't seem to bother him. And in terms of the other aspects of the economy, we're not seeing the massive inflationary pressure that was feared beforehand. We're seeing the economy, booming. We're seeing the markets, seem to be, moving along without worrying about these sorts of things. So I think they realize now that they are going to have to, if they want to lower the tariff, they are going to have to do serious things, and they have to mean it, because the particular dispute settlement mechanism of these agreements will be the president will be raising the tariff again.
Right. Yeah, he's clearly not afraid of doing that. I want to ask you, so what did we concede? Because I feel like, President Trump's rhetoric and looking at the history of our American negotiators, our president, which was most recently, obviously, Joe Biden, but, even back to Bush and, of course, Obama. I mean, like you said earlier, the United States has kind of been taken. We have not, it hasn't really been balanced trade deals across the board. Is President Trump's mentality that we've given up enough, or were there further concessions by the United States, or did we make out pretty good?
Yeah, we didn't really make too many concessions in the way that trade people talk about, concessions and so on. I don't. That language is not great language because, if you're improving your own regulatory system, you're doing it because it's good for you. I mean, it's not just you do as a concession. But so you could argue that the Europeans have made a lot of concessions in that way, but actually they're doing things that are going to ultimately help their own economy. I think, if you want to look at a particular concession, well, he's gone from 30% to 15%, with a lot of, good purchase commitments and things from the EU, but without a lot of, commitments behind regulatory reform. So that's the next phase. So I would argue that he's shown quite a lot of, he's shown willing by going from 30 to 15. And, if I were the EU, I would say, look, this is pretty good. That we got from 30 to 15. That's a very big deal for the European Union. And that's the major concession that they've won. And they've done it without actually having to change all of these regulatory things before getting the concession. They've been able to get an agreement which invites them to make those changes in the future, and we'll discuss those changes in the future with them. But they're getting the 15 without making them. So that's a pretty big, statement of trust. Sure. President to the European Union. And if I were the Commission, I would be wary about, or if I were a member state, I would be wary about abusing that trust.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that was a pretty darn mature move by President Trump. I know a lot of people find him to be blustery and ostentation and all of that, but it seems like when he has these conversations and these negotiations that he's quite level-headed. He fights for the United States, but yeah, I mean, I suppose that it all goes back to his art of the deal because he stands his ground, but at the same time, he ends up making these very, very hopefully beneficial on both side trade deals. So, Shanker, it is always a wonderful conversation when I have you here. You always have so much wisdom and insight into all this, and my audience loves you. I've had plenty of feedback from them from when I've had you on in the past. Tell everybody where they can find more about you.
Yeah, so you can look me up on www.shankersingham.com or at my company, which is www.competere. Competere means compete so much. We believe in competition so much as the name of the company. So www.competere.co.uk and either find me.
Wonderful. Shanker, thanks so much for being here, and we'll get you back on again soon because, India, Korea, whoever comes down the pike next will probably want to revisit this conversation and examine those deals as well. So we'll see you soon.
Absolutely. Thanks very much.
All right. Okay, everybody, we're going to take a quick break and we will be right back on the other side.